The Russian invasion of Ukraine is one of the greatest crises to hit Europe or the world in decades. And many of you are as worried as I am about the potential implications of this crisis, both for Ukrainians first and foremost, but also for Europe, for the whole global order that the US has led since World War II. Now, the war, we can say after a few weeks, is in a very fluid situation. It could go in a lot of different directions. But it's safe to say that it is already a failure for Putin, at least relative to his initial expectations. We don't know exactly what Putin intended, but it's clear, I would say, that he didn't intend this to be a war in any meaningful sense. What Putin had in mind was more like a coup or a fait accompli, where small numbers of Russian forces would pour into Ukraine, quickly capture Kiev, Kharkov, and other strategic sites, either topple the Zelensky government or maybe force Zelensky to sign some pieces of paper that would effectively turn Ukraine into some sort of puppet regime of Russia, or even incorporate large parts of it into Russia. And what has happened, of course, is starkly different. The latest estimates are that in the first few weeks of the fighting, Russia has lost maybe 7,000, maybe 10,000 fatalities. And this, of course, is because, first and foremost, of the heroic resistance of the Ukrainian forces, supplied by Western allies, but also because of just extraordinary mismanagement in the Russian military, and incredible overconfidence by Putin. And partly this is because Putin is living in a bubble. He, at this point in his regime, having been in power for 2 decades, is surrounded by yes men. Is not getting the kind of critical voices that you need before you launch a military operation. Americans often think about war as if it's this sort of a neat distinction between war and peace. That you have peacetime, and then a war breaks out, and the soldiers rally and they fight this war, and it ends in a clear, unconditional surrender for one of the sides and a peace treaty. So the American vision of war is sort of World War II, with the Japanese surrender in Tokyo Bay. But this vision of war would say that the Ukraine conflict should end in a similarly clear-cut outcome for one of the sides, and we shouldn't try to create an off-ramp for Putin. Instead, await his clear-cut defeat. But most wars do not end in that kind of World War II style unconditional surrender. Most wars end in some kind of deal. And this is because war is really a form of bargaining. So let me give you an example of how the Ukraine war is a kind of a form of bargaining, and that war and peace are very much blurred. So in the run-up to the war, in fact, for quite a long time, Russia has paid Ukraine to transship Russian gas across Ukraine to Europe. So Ukraine gets a fee for allowing this pipeline to send gas to Europe. And remarkably, Russia is still paying Ukraine today to send that gas across the country to Europe. Even as Russia is leveling Ukrainian cities, Russia's handing millions of dollars over to Ukraine to pay for this gas that Ukraine then uses to buy weapons to kill Russians. Why? Because Russia has concluded that keeping the gas flowing is important for Russia's broader interests, and while it probably doesn't want to have to pay Ukraine, that's actually a price it's willing to pay. Ukraine is willing to take the money that it can use to buy weapons. And so what we're seeing in Ukraine today, if you sort of look through the fog of war, if you sort of see through the smoke and the devastated cities and the horrors of the war that we're all deeply impacted by, what is going on there is a form of bargaining between the two sides. And Sometimes that bargaining is literally negotiations, and sometimes it is through shell fire or Ukrainian missiles or other uses of force. So the Ukraine war will end in some kind of deal. And we need to think through what that deal might look like. And we need to think through what are the potential off-ramps or ways of de-escalating or ways of avoiding the very worst outcomes possible. The Chinese strategist, famous strategist Sun Tzu, said that you should build your opponent a golden bridge on which he could retreat across. And the West in Ukraine is going to have to think about, along with the Ukrainians, building Putin a golden bridge on which he can retreat across if the situation does end up in a stalemate and if Russia cannot achieve victory. So this is going to involve some concessions to Russia. Most likely, Ukraine will agree it will not join NATO. There may also be some sort of token compromise on, denazification, which is actually kind of easy to compromise on because there just aren't very many Nazis in Ukraine. And perhaps also some compromise on demilitarization of Ukraine. Ukraine might agree it won't host foreign military bases or certain kinds of weapons. As long as Ukraine can keep the defensive weapons that will deter a future Russian invasion, then that might be acceptable. And so Putin may see these types of face-saving compromises as enough that he can sort of sell a story to the Russian people. Now here, the best bridge is actually not a golden bridge for Putin, but a gilded bridge. What I mean by that is a bridge that looks shiny enough that Putin retreats across it in the belief that he can sell this to the Russian people. But in time, the tawdry nature and limited extent of Russia's gains in the war become clear. And in time, Russians recognize this disastrous adventure for what it has been, a cruel, barbaric catastrophe for Russian interests. The number one actor here in negotiating with Russia is Ukraine. And it's up to them, the Ukrainians, the brave Ukrainians, to decide first and foremost what they're willing to compromise on. And then, of course, the US and its other allies will play a key role, certainly in terms of when America might, for example, lift some or all of the sanctions. What are going to be the longer-term consequences of this? Well, first of all, there is a danger of escalation, threats that Russia might use chemical weapons and even nuclear weapons. That is, of course, a key risk that helps drive the need to ultimately make some sort of deal. A lot of people are worried that this is going to cause the collapse of the global order around, rules and global institutions and you don't annex territory and so on. But it's possible that this could actually inspire renewal of the global order, because we've actually seen an extraordinary response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where the European Union has really got its act together. And Germany, for example, has transformed its foreign policy just in a matter of weeks and is now intending to be a much more serious player on the world stage with military resources to match. In some ways, Putin's clear-cut aggression is actually going to strengthen the order. And it was, ironically, Putin's more limited attacks and his efforts to sort of drive a wedge, between the Europeans and encourage Brexit and try to get Trump elected in 2016. In some ways, those were the more effective ways to undermine the order, because they worked on these internal divisions in America and in Europe and elsewhere, whereas his just overt, clear aggression might actually massively backfire. And then finally, for Ukraine, this event, this war, is going to be the founding event in modern Ukrainian history. People are going to be building statues to Zelensky and reading out his famous lines. We need ammo, we don't need a ride, and these other things like this for a long time. Countries are built on stories, and there are so many powerful stories here that for all the devastation that Ukraine is suffering, this, I think, will be their great patriotic war.